In the spring of 1966, Dr. Goldstein was invited to visit a warehouse of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where the original Princeton computer is stored. He was accompanied by Dr. Uta Mertzebach of the Smithsonian staff.
Oh, these things would have fascinated Johnny. He used to love toys. When he worked on the on his automata theory at the beginnings, he started, since he had to make three-dimensional objects, he bought the biggest Tinker toy set that he could find, and he made the objects out of these until we showed him one time how to make these two-dimensionally, so he was able to give the Tinker toys to Morgenstern's son.
Oh, really?
Yes. Well, as Johnny would have said, mercy. Here it is. All these years. May I move the curtain?
Would you?
Sure, be glad to. Let's see what it looks like. If I can do it. Very good. I succeeded.
There you are.
Yes?
I'll leave you now.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein.
This machine was the concrete embodiment of von Neumann's very great ideas and contributions which he has made to the electronic computer field. In 1946, Johnny asked me if I would join him at the end of the war in Princeton and help him to carry out in concrete form the ideas which he had been working on in 1944 and 1945. Of course, I jumped at the chance. We rushed to Princeton and got started. The machine that eventuated from that is the one you see here, and it contains essentially those things which the modern computer has in it, although in somewhat primitive form. This machine has stored program concept as its major feature, and that, in fact, is the thing which makes the modern computer revolution possible. The older machines required one to clumsily perform hand pluggings of connections which took hours, indeed days. It meant that programming was an art, in fact, a very black art, and furthermore, it meant that the total number of instructions one could write were comparatively small. This new concept has been carried so far today that programs are written involving tens of millions of instructions, whereas in those days, of course, nobody dreamed of such complexity, but Johnny's idea made this basically possible. What is this stored program concept? Well, it's the notion that you can describe in a finite number of words, in fact, a fairly small number of words, in a fairly simple language, exactly and unequivocally the description of a problem, and that this description is then translated into binary digits and stored in the memory of the computer exactly as numbers are stored. This was the discovery by Johnny. You may say, what's so remarkable about that? Well, the only thing I can tell you in answer to that is it's just like the wheel. What's so remarkable about the wheel? When you look at it, you can't conceive how anybody would not have known that there was one. Indeed, it must have been that the moment somebody mentioned the wheel or somebody mentioned the stored program, everybody around us obviously knew that this was the way to do it. And in fact, we accepted it immediately. It was not one of these inventions or discoveries which is enormously complicated and few people can understand. It's tremendously simple. It immediately hits a person and he knows that's it. Now, this, I believe, was his great discovery. And curiously enough, it relates back in a very interesting way to his very early mathematical works, which were in the domain of formal logics. He, however, had other interests, and I think his second great contribution to the computing field lay in his work at Los Alamos in showing the experimental people there how it was possible by mathematical modeling to formulate the problems with which they were grappling in mathematical form, indeed in systems of partial differential equations which express the conservation laws of hydrodynamics. And then to translate those complicated, implicit equations into explicit, finite systems of difference equations. And these systems of difference equations then can be solved on the computer. And indeed, this is the reason why initially he had this great interest in the computer. But you see, it led him to develop many of the things in numerical analysis that we know today. Now, the third thing, really, which he did for the field was to bring his great prestige to the subject, to make the notion of computation stylish, if you will. He showed people that it's no longer necessary to do tedious experimentation, that it's possible much more conveniently to do experiments, if you will, on the computer by numerical techniques. I think in part he did this because he was very much of the computer himself. He had great facility at numerical processes. And in fact, I can tell you an anecdote which I think may interest you some. It happened down at Aberdeen early on during the war, and what he was doing then was consulting frequently at Aberdeen, coming on up to Philadelphia to talk with us about the ENIAC. Now, this particular day, in fact, the day prior to this one, a young mathematician who subsequently has become a famous person had come in with several colleagues, and we were talking about a problem with which he was grappling. And he was getting nowhere and asked our help. Well, none of us was able to do anything with it analytically. So he said, well, the heck with it. I'm going to take a computer, a Frieden or Marchant or Monroe home tonight, and I'm going to calculate a few special cases. And fine, he did. And the next morning he came in at 5:30 looking awful. He had bags under his eyes. He was fatigued. He was unshaved. He was, in fact, in very bad way, but he had triumphed. He had calculated the first 5 cases. And he was busy telling us about this when who should bust in but Johnny from Los Alamos. And he said, well, what's new, fellas? And we said, oh, well, so-and-so has been busy with the following idea, and he's in trouble with it. And he said, well, let's see what it's like. And he tried for a couple of minutes, and he said, no, he said, that's sort of intractable analytically. Let me see what's doing with this thing numerically. Let me evaluate a few cases. So he did. In about 1 minute, he threw his head back, and he said, 16.75. And you could hear the numbers rolling through his head. You could actually hear them. He was mumbling them. And in about a minute, he did the first case, and maybe a minute and a quarter the second, and a minute and a half the third, and 2 minutes the fourth. And he came then to the crucial case, the one which this fellow had spent his whole night working out. And this chap was very clever, and he listened closely to von Neumann as he was rolling through n equals 5. And when he judged he was about halfway through, he recognized a number, and he waited an instant, and then he said 26.75. And you could just see von Neumann kind of come to a shuddering halt. And he said, huh? And this boy said, 26.75, Professor von Neumann. And von Neumann said, just a minute. And he got very nervous, and he began to compute again, and you could hear the tempo going up much more than it had before. And after another minute, he said 26.75. Yes, he says, that's right. And whereupon this fellow ran out of the room because he couldn't stand it any longer, and I made childish chatter trying to keep von Neumann distracted while he paced up and down nervously, saying to himself, how could that guy have possibly done that? What trick? And after an hour or so, we finally told him. But at any rate, that's sufficient to illustrate his great ability as a computer himself and the great feeling he had for computation. This whole field owes so much to von Neumann's genius that it's really very difficult to tell you exactly what would have happened if this hadn't been built. I can only say that his stored program concept might not ever have been discovered by another person, or it might have taken many years before it was discovered, and almost as important as that, perhaps, not from a mathematician's point of view, but from a economic point of view, his great prestige as a mathematician sold the notion of the computer and its great importance to the industrialists and to the government officials who made this whole development possible.